So good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome to the Munk School the former Deputy Minister of Global Affairs, Marta Morgan. Welcome, Marta. We're thrilled to have you here. This is part of our series, Women Leaders in the Public Service. We have three outstanding women leaders who are all involved in one way or the other, broadly in responsibilities on national security. And I can say, I think that Canada is unique at this point internationally to have not only women ministers of defense and foreign affairs, but to have a deputy minister of global affairs who is a woman, to have a national security advisor to the prime minister who is a woman. And you all met Chris Hogan when she was here last week, who also has a broad background in national security as well as in the environment. Let me just say a word about Marta Morgan. There is almost nobody in the government who has worked in senior positions in so many departments across the government. It's remarkable. Marta is an economist by training, so encouraging to all the people who are struggling with economics in one of our programs. Keep it up and do not give up. It's an important part of your public policy skills going forward. And has worked in industry, has worked in finance, senior positions in at least three other departments that I remember, and then left the government for 6 years to take a senior role in the forestry sector, came back, and her last position was as Deputy Minister of Global Affairs. Marta, we asked every one of the deputies to pick a talented leader that they would bring with them. You remember that. And Marta picked Tara Denham. Tara has had an absolutely outstanding career. She is the Director General for Human Rights, Freedom and Inclusion in Global Affairs. She actually stood up the Digital Inclusion Lab in Global Affairs, and I know that's going to interest many of you. She's upstairs on the phone because she had to take an urgent call from the government. That's why she's not here with us. As soon as that call is finished, she's going to come in and join us, and she will join the conversation with us. Marta and I are going to start this off with just an informal back and forth question and answer session, and then we're going to open it up to you. Let me ask, please, because we will have a more frank and more open discussion, no tweeting. For the next hour, absolutely no tweeting, and I'm taking everybody at anybody object to that? Okay, we've all committed together then that we're not going to tweet. We will have a freer discussion and no attribution. In other words, we can talk about the issues, but it cannot be, Deputy Morgan said. And I actually like it better when it's not Janice Stein said either. It works for me too. So thank you all for your understanding. We'll have a conversation for 20 minutes or so, then we'll open it up. And involve all of you in the conversation as well. So I'm going to join you here. Marta, you're the first woman leader that Global Affairs has had in this country. Tell us a little bit about the challenges you faced in your career in the public service as a woman, about the gratification of being the first woman deputy in global affairs, and about the opportunities women have today in Canada's public service?
Okay, great question, Janice. It's interesting. So when we, in some federal departments in the government of Canada, outside of on the wall, as you walk into the office of the minister or of the deputy minister, there's a whole wall of pictures of your predecessors. And in my case, every day as I walk past the wall, all of my predecessors were men. And many of them, some of the more recent ones I knew very well and had worked with, and actually had mentored me over the years. So I'd kind of look at them for inspiration some days, for advice. I'd stare into their eyes and say, okay. But every day it actually kind of reminded me that I was part of the arc of history. And that part of my contribution was really about the history of Canada's public service becoming more open to women leaders and becoming more diverse in general. When I first came into the government many years ago, there weren't that many senior women in general, and certainly not in the economic space, which is really where I started. There were not very many women leaders, and we all really looked up to those women and followed the trajectory of their career very much, because it gave us sort of confidence that things were changing, and it gave us role models that we knew that we could follow. So when I came into, and so I really feel that I was kind of moved on the tide of history, because as I came in, our society was changing, the public service was changing, the people in the public service genuinely wanted to see women succeed, and they wanted to see women in these roles. And so I feel very fortunate for that, for when I came in, and for all the people that helped me along the way. And also to be able to give that kind of role modeling and that kind of hope to the women who are following behind me. And certainly when I came in as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the women in the department were incredibly welcoming. There's a very active women's network within the department, and they were really excited to see a woman in the role. I made very strong connections with some of my women colleagues globally, including Wendy Sherman, who has my role in the United States, and Angeles Morales, who has my role in Spain, and we actually had, I think, a bit of a special bond having those roles as women. So I really think the public service, many of you are students, I can tell just by looking at you. And, the federal public service is a great place. It's a great place, I think, for people to work. It's a great place to have a career. It's super welcoming for women in leadership roles. It's very attuned to issues around diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we've got a representative workforce. And I think that it's actually, it's really exciting. So I'm not there anymore, but come join us.
I'm sure it's going to be us for a long time. Marta, tell us a little bit about the impact mentors had at different stages in your career. We talk a lot about that at the Munk School. How important was mentorship for you?
Well, I sort of think of it as not so much, for me anyways, not so much mentors, but more of an ecosystem, right? There are different ways that you get support in the workplace. I remember when I first came in as I was actually just out of my undergrad, not even grad school, came into the Privy Council office. There was this guy named Rod Quiney. Rod was a senior analyst. He was assigned to me. And he must have wondered, like, what's she doing here? And everything I wrote, Rod would take his time and write on it in red pen. That's how we did it then, and send it back to me. I'd rewrite it again. He'd look at it again, write on it in red pen, send it back to me, and eventually when I got it right, I'd be like, okay, good, I got it past Rod, But I just tell that anecdote because there's people in the workplace that help you along the way. Some of them are your colleagues, by helping you understand the organizational culture. Some of them are your superiors that you're reporting to, who teach you the things that you need to know to actually be effective in the organization. There's so much tacit knowledge in a career that builds up. You're getting the academic knowledge, but when you're actually in the workplace, a lot of what gets added is knowledge, but tacit knowledge as well. And so you can have, you know, your direct superiors, your bosses, like the people that you look at and say, okay, how does that person lead? And what would I take from that? And what do I think is effective? And what do I not think is effective? Those people are, I found to be incredibly helpful. And I worked for amazing people over the years, men and women, who were just great leaders and inspirational leaders. And then some of whom you develop a closer relationship with, and you can have those discussions about career and seek their advice when you're making career decisions. And for me, I found it very fluid. But I guess I would say for somebody starting out, you know, there's a lot of people that actually really want to be helpful and constructive. And if you ask, people will often volunteer their time and their advice to you, and help you along the way in different ways. And that was certainly my case in all of those various ways that really made a difference to me.
It's absolutely great advice. Ask for help. People are often really willing to give because they're invested in your success. Right?
Absolutely. And actually, you know, one of the things I actually have learned over time is that people actually like helping other people. And actually, it's kind of weird because you think, oh, it's going to take up their time or it's going to be inconvenient. But actually, they really like, often you will find that people really want to help. They want to discuss things. They want to share their wisdom. They want to share their advice. And then also once you kind of get known, like what I found is that once I got a bit known, you know, people would sort of seek me out and sort of help sort of pull me up along the way, or just be there when I needed to talk if I was facing a difficult choice or a difficult work issue.
Without revealing any secrets, Marta, tell us about a difficult moment in your career as a public servant, which when you think back,
I'm going to tell you.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to give you two difficult moments. Okay. Both in my most recent job, not surprisingly. Yeah. The first one was August 26th, 2021, when there was a suicide bombing outside of the airport, right outside of the fence in Kabul, in Afghanistan, that killed 13 US soldiers and 60 Afghans. And I actually kind of get the shivers just thinking about it, because they were working at the Abbey Gate. And a mere 36 hours previous, we had members of the Canadian Armed Forces and members of our global affairs staff who were working at the Abbey Gate to get Afghans safely out of Afghanistan and bring them to Canada. And so it was a really difficult moment, because I think, you know, we all know this in the kinds of jobs that we do, that the safety of Canadians is in our hands. And I felt just such a sense of sorrow for the Americans who lost their lives doing their jobs and trying to get Afghans to the United States and pull them into the airport. And I also felt a real crystallization of my responsibility as a leader, as a deputy minister who had my employees in that dangerous situation, and that it could have just as easily been us. So I don't know, I guess for me, the real takeaway from that was the need to be, first of all, the need to recognize the responsibility that we have as public servants. It's not always life and death, thank God, but sometimes it is. And also, and the need to make decisions in a way that really recognizes the kinds of risks that are present and the risks that we're taking, and that is transparent about that, and that it's well understood. So that was a really tough moment. The other one actually was partway through, like it was in about April, so a couple of months into after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it wasn't so much one thing, but I think it was just accumulation of, you know, the months of work that we'd been putting in to support Ukraine, and to isolate Russia and to work with our allies. And just this moment of like, what is happening here that we are dealing in 2022 with this pointless conflict. It was right after Bucha had been retaken by the Ukrainians, and we're seeing really in real time the kind of human rights abuses that would happen. And it was just that sort of a bit of a feeling of like, what is happening in the world, and why do we have to deal with this? And for me, it was a bit of a leadership moment, because when I had that day, and then I went back into the office and met with my team, and Tara was leading the Ukraine task force. And so every day we would meet at like 8 in the morning, sit around the table in a secure room, and we'd do all the updates and where people were at. And I looked around the table and I thought, okay, we need to build some resilience in our team, because I could see that same look in the eyes of other people around the table. And it was, for me, that was a moment where, beyond the geopolitics of it, which we were very well equipped for, we had a dedicated team, we had lots of expertise, we were pulling in from the whole department, we were working with other departments, we were working across with our allies. But there are those moments when you're leading a team where you realize, okay, we need to make sure that we've got resilience. We need to make sure, because everyone's dealing with this same extremely difficult circumstance every day, and they're coming in and they're putting it all on the table. But okay, have you had a break? Have you had a break? Who's backing this person up? Can we pull in 5 more people? And so I used that as a moment really of reflection for myself to say, okay, how am I going to lead this here? And how are we going to make sure that we can, like, this was, you know, 2 months in, how are we going to make sure we're ready for the next 6 months? And how are we, you know, and how are we going to be ready for beyond that?
I mean, that's really critical, the story that you're describing, because the responsibilities that Tara and Marta, because Tara is leading the Ukraine team in the department, that's the responsibility that the deputy gave to her. Both of them have families. These are 18, 19-hour-a-day jobs at that moment. So thinking hard about how you look after yourself and how you look after your team, because this was not 2 weeks, it's not 4 weeks, it's not 2 months, it's not 4 months. So that's, I think, a critical element of leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that you brought that one up. Tara, how did it feel to you?
Well, I mean, you can't get around it. It was intense. It is intense. It continues to be intense for the team. And so, yeah, you really, for me, I was brought in just as the invasion happened and asked to stand up this team. I think what I found was, at the time, there was a lot of people across the public service that wanted to contribute. So it wasn't only in our department, it was across the public service. And so I was quite energized by the different types and people with different backgrounds, a lot of Ukrainian Canadians that wanted to help. So I sort of used that. So I brought in a lot of different people. It takes a lot of time to bring somebody new into the department, but I did. I complemented it with those that understood the department and those that wanted to help. And you can create a lot of synergies and energy, because you're there together, you're working on it all the time, and you have to be there for each other. So I actually tried to create an environment of real commitment to each other, so that you can sort of survive through that. But then the other part of the support network, so when I was asked to take on the job, yeah, you do have to think about that in a very, so I have a 7-year-old son, And so I had to set up the structures, not only with my husband and with my son, but then your support network and your friends and everybody, because you know you're moving into a period of time where this will be your entire life for that period of time, more or less. But I get very motivated because I know I'm having an immediate impact. I know that it's saving lives. I know that it's a major foreign policy priority, and I know I have something to give. So that's what drives me.
You've been involved in so many departments. How different is GAC? Is there a story?
Close your eyes, Sarah.
There is a GAC culture. The GAC is different from other. Now we could say that about D&D, and we could say that about finance, but we're actually talking about GAC.
So
Global Affairs Canada, known as GAC.
So prior to being the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs, I was the Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. And then previous to that, I'd been at a couple of other departments, as Janice mentioned. But when about 6 months in, I would joke that moving from IRCC to GAC was like moving from being the Deputy Minister of the Netherlands. Bicycles, canals, lovely art galleries, coffee, chocolate, to being the Deputy Minister of the Roman Empire. Fractious lords, conflicts on all of the borders, rebellions breaking out, and crises in the middle of the night, so it's GAC is, I think, very unique, and I've had the privilege of working in many departments and seeing into different departments. But really what it is that Global Affairs Canada reflects the complexity of the global environment. And it requires a deep understanding of geopolitics and global trends. It requires an ability to exercise influence at the global level. So, a network of 160 offices in 110 countries around the world. In order to do that, it requires an understanding of how domestic and global interests interlink and connect, and it also requires the ability to deploy the appropriate tools to pursue Canada's interests on a very kind of broad global scale. So by necessity, it's a very complex department. It's very multifaceted. It also includes the government's trade function and our international assistance programming, which I think is terrific because it allows us to look across foreign policy issues and across trade issues into foreign policy and make the connections that we really need to make to be more effective. But it does make it quite complicated, right. But also full of incredible depth and people who are super talented, people who are really committed, people who love the international dimensions of what they do, people who are really brave, right? People, people who, one of the things that I thought was fascinating was, at the beginning of COVID, right, when the government of China shut down Wuhan, we actually sent a team of 6 people from our embassy in Beijing to Wuhan at the beginning of an international global pandemic that no one knew anything about, to get Canadians home, right? So we chartered a plane because there were Canadians in Wuhan. There's literally Canadians everywhere. Yes. So you learn this at Global Affairs. And we sent a team of people, and they basically set up shop in a hotel in Wuhan, worked with the Chinese government, and helped do all of the logistics and planning to help identify the Canadians, get them the information they need, get them on the plane, got on the plane with them, flew back to Canada, went into quarantine for 2 weeks, and then came out, and I met with them all, and they loved it. Right? They were just like, yeah, that was fun. Can we do that again? So there's a certain kind of a spirit, I think, in global affairs of people who are very adventurous and pretty much up for anything.
Intrepid.
Intrepid, yeah.
Marta, one of the things that Canadians say to me a lot right now is they are worried about where the world is going. They're apprehensive. And sometimes they can't even give expression to the anxiety, but they feel that, and I see some heads nodding in the room, that the world is not going in a good direction. As you leave global affairs and move on to the next stage of your career, what are you most concerned about as you think about the world? Where are you concerned? We come from a privileged country with genuinely multicultural, high standard of living, living next door to a neighbor who has no intention of invading us. That is not something that we actually have to think about. And on the ground, secure. We are not facing a winter without heat. So we're very, very fortunate. And yet there's palpable anxiety in the country.
Yeah, we are very fortunate. At the same time, we're very interconnected. And I think if there's one thing that we all took from COVID was a recognition of how interconnected we are globally, right? We just lived through the first truly global pandemic in 100 years. In my career in the public service, it's really the first international crisis that really hit every Canadian, right? We've had big recessions, including 2008, 2009, which significantly impacted some people in some parts of the country, but Canada generally did fairly well. Had big recessions in the 80s and the 90s that were really hard for people economically. But this touched everybody. And I think it reminded us all of our global interconnectedness. And it made it clear that to resolve global problems, we need to work together, we need to cooperate, we need global solutions. And I know you had Chris Hogan here a few weeks ago, who's been devoting all of her time and energy to climate change, which I think is another obvious example of that, right? We're not going to succeed on climate change unless we're all in. And I think there is a legitimate sense of insecurity about whether our institutions are robust enough to get us through some of these crises, whether the level of international collaboration and goodwill is there, and ability to work and willingness to work together to address global issues is there. I think that those are real questions that we need to answer, and those are issues that we need to work on with our allies within international institutions and with countries that we don't necessarily see eye to eye on some things, but that we need to work with on issues of the global common. And then, of course, the other thing I think is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, we haven't seen a conflict like this in Europe since the end of the Second World War. We thought that we were on a trajectory, a more positive, peaceful trajectory. And I think that it has been, that it is very preoccupying for all of us to see Russia invade its neighbor in clear contravention of international norms for no reason, completely unprovoked, the kind of violence that's going on. That is very preoccupying, and the knock-on effects that we're seeing. So, we've seen this year the significant rise in the price of grain that's hitting, North Africa, Lebanon, parts of the Middle East the hardest. We've seen the rise in the price of fuel and fuel availability in Europe. Next year, the Food and Agriculture Organization is predicting that the next sort of wave of impact will be on rice production because of the challenges of getting fertilizer to farmers in Asia. So we're seeing significant knock-on impacts globally of this aggression. And I think, you know, obviously from a foreign policy perspective at the moment, that's challenge number one.
So if you had to make some decisions about resources, Marta, where would you focus our resources in a world full of demands, all of them meritorious, but we're a small country. Where would you focus? Where do you think Canada has a chance to really move a needle, make an impact?
Well, you know, it's a good question, right? It's a hard question,
Very
right?
hard
Because,
question.
you know, it's a question as in government that we always ask ourselves, right? Because, you know, resources are limited. It's not just about money. It's about talent. It's about your human resources, right? You know, that's really what we have to bring to bear to these global issues. I think obviously the government, you know, I'm no longer in the government, but, you know, I think I can speak for this government to say that they're going to continue the efforts to support Ukraine, to isolate Russia and to work closely with our allies, not just on those direct issues related to the conflict, but also on the knock-on effects, right? So that we can help through global institutions, whether it's the World Bank, the FAO, the IMF, to try and mitigate some of the impact, the unfortunate impact of this around the rest of the world, right? Because we don't want to see more conflict arising because of even more difficult economic circumstances. So that's obviously one. Another one that I won't elaborate much on, I'll let Tara talk about, is I think the whole bundle of issues around democracy, the evolution of the digital space, human rights. These are the issues of now, but they're also the issues of 5 and 10 years from now. So if we think about some of the structural issues, and they're actually issues where Canada's got great networks, where we've got deep expertise, where we've got a really kind of active, vibrant civil society. And then we need to keep up our efforts on international assistance. We need to be really as effective and as generous as possible to support both, health, well-being, but also governance. I think globally and national governance in countries that are fragile or where there's the potential for improvement, and continue to promote international rules and norms, because including on trade, because Canada is one of the countries that has a lot of credibility in that space. I think the fact that we are sort of a middle power, we devote significant resources into international institutions, we've got really good capacity for that sort of work. It's a good space for us, because you have to think about what issues matter, and you have to also think about what do we have to bring to them, and where's kind of our value add.
So it's aligning all those values that are so important to us with our capacity, right? And it's hard sometimes because there are things you want to do that you can't, and that's agonizing. I'm going to actually go off script and ask everybody to forgive me for 2 minutes, but one of the issues that deputy ministers have to deal with is unfair press. It is press that reports inaccurately, just as we're leading into disinformation. Deputy ministers are hobbled because they cannot speak out to defend themselves, even though the article is just flat out wrong. I say that because in this last year, we've had what is, in my view, irresponsible reporting about our embassy in Ukraine, in which the information was just wrong. So I say this to everybody because I think it's very important that we speak out. I did when in previous cases, you know, for another deputy, but that we as an academic community and as caring citizens, that we speak out when public servants are pilloried and do not have the opportunity to defend themselves in response. Because if we don't speak out to defend our very finest public servants, we will not attract the quality of these two women to join, and we will not get the best of you to join. So it's important that we be informed. And if you have doubts about a story, press, because reporters make mistakes, just like everybody else. But senior deputies are uniquely unable to defend themselves in a way that the rest of us would. So I want you all to know that Marta was in that position and not able to defend herself, and that it's very, very important the rest of us do it for her and take that as a shared responsibility if we want to keep the high quality public service that we have.
Maybe just one point I'll make about that, Janice, is, you know, one of the things that I appreciate so much about Janice is that, among all the many other things, is the informed perspective that she brings to the debate about foreign policy in Canada. And I think that as you pursue your careers, one of the things that I think is really important, and as we think about ourselves in a more interconnected world where our international relationships and our ability to work together is even more important than it always has been, helping Canadians just be informed about not so much sort of what's going on within the Canadian government, but what are the perspectives that other countries are bringing to these issues? What are the barriers to making progress? Where is the space for collaboration? Why are things happening the way they are in parts of the world that we are concerned about? I think that really sort of informed foreign policy voice is really important, because the more that Canadians are informed, I think the better decisions that they can support. And so that's one thing that I'm always glad to see Janice on the news, because I know that there's going to be, people are going to get a very balanced perspective on whatever's going on that's really coming from a global perspective and not just from Canada's perspective, because sometimes it's a bit easy for us to get into our own sort of perspective on things and not realize or not fully understand, you know, the environment that we're operating in.
Thank you for that. I can tell you that Marta and I have disagreed at times, and
occasionally we disagree.
So it's not about agreement, but it is about an open and honest conversation, which is so important to have in this country. Now, I was going to talk about Tara, but you know what, Marta? You chose Tara.
I did.
As an outstanding leader in global affairs. Tell us why you think she's so wonderful.
Okay.
This never happens in your career.
No, you know, normally we try and hide this from people, because, you know, we don't want them to, you know, think too well of themselves or anything in the government. We're modest people. No, look, I nominated Tara for this because I first met Tara when I was brand new to the department, and I went down to get a briefing, and I say down literally like into the basement to get a briefing on the digital inclusion lab, which Tara had been instrumental in setting up following Canada's hosting of the G7 meeting in Charlevoix. And that lab was, I'll probably completely get this all wrong, so Tara can correct me, but what was really groundbreaking about that group was bringing in people with really strong technical expertise to look at the issue. It started really with foreign interference in elections, and it kind of came out of the issues around foreign interference in the US election, and how was social media being used, and how could we do analysis that would help us ascertain if there was foreign interference in our elections, in other G7 countries, in other countries in Europe. And so we were working with countries throughout the G7, but to look at foreign interference and where were we seeing it and what were the trends. And it was very, I would call it small but mighty team, but very, very cutting edge. Because what we saw in COVID, for example, was the spread of disinformation. Right. And it wasn't necessarily it wasn't foreign interference, but it was the same kind of phenomenon of how does information spread and how does it influence public opinion that then people with the governments had to grapple with on domestic policy issues that were vital to Canadians' health and safety. So it was very cutting edge, great team. And then Tara did some other things, but also we pulled her in on Ukraine to be the head of the Ukraine task force. And the Ukraine task force was really complicated because working on issues around sanctions, working on pulling together intelligence. So working on policy response within the department, working with the Department of National Defense, working with Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. So a whole of department, whole of government effort that had to be coordinated. And Tara really kind of grabbed the reins of that and did that for us with great calm under pressure, with good humor, and with a reputation for being somebody that people really like to work for, even during the most difficult circumstances. So that's why I picked you, Tara.
So Tara, take a few minutes and tell us what you're doing now as Director General for Human Rights, Freedom, and Inclusion. Especially, and Tara's especially interested in the digital world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to both of you, of course, for inviting me, and to Marta for nominating me. I joke, but it's really amazing to be recognized because we do our work. We just work really hard. And that's amazing. And when Marta wrote me to say that she regarded me in this way and that others in the department regarded me in this way, it was really meaningful. So thank you for this opportunity. And so yes, after Ukraine, I got to sleep, and then I took on the role of the DG of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion. It actually brought me back to the team where I first met Marta. So I was the director and worked on and created that Digital Inclusion Lab, and have now come back as the Director General, which is really fun because I get to still work on those files that I just became so passionate about. I think so digital and emerging technology is in no way part of my past. I was actually mostly in programming, and I worked on peace and security issues. But I can say that for somebody that at my point in my career got really, really interested, and that was through working and recruiting people, as Marta said, that came from a very different background from me. I sought out a lot of people from universities that came with that digital prowess and understanding the digital environment. I also recruited people that knew a lot about artificial intelligence and what that looked like. And so for me, it actually meant that at that point, as I was helping to build the team, I actually got to learn as the team learned, and actually as the department learned, because this hadn't actually been a line of work for the department before. Right. And so I can say that once you're in that world and you actually you're learning about it and you're becoming very comfortable, you become very passionate about it. Because I think it ties back to your question about where Canada can invest. I do think that understanding the digital environment and emerging technologies and what it means for democracy, what it means for the interconnectedness of the world, and what is actually happening to the geopolitical landscape, a lot of people aren't paying attention to that. And I find that incredibly interesting, but I also find it's a space that Canada can push the envelope. And so, you know, we're continuing to push the envelope there. So on the disinformation space, that teams continue to grow. So yes, I think we're about 6 people at the time, and I think we're at about 25 now, which is incredible. And Canada gets a lot of praise for the rapid response mechanism and what it's contributed. So that's fantastic. And that is a small investment, but a leadership role that Canada continues to play. We're now trying to do the same, and we have been doing the same around artificial intelligence and emerging technology, right? So again, a small country, but we have expertise in Canada. And so if we can harness that and then link it with the foreign policy lens, we can, what we classically say, like punch above our weight. We can actually get a lot of countries to sort of push their thinking. And those are spaces that when we walk into the room, people are looking to Canada. And so that's where I find it really exciting, and why I was happy to come back into the role as the DG for that team. And then I really see, you know, of course, that's the digital, and I have cyber as well, cyber policy, human rights, democracy. And you can see how these all come together. They're absolutely connected in today's world. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what excites me.
I hope you can all hear what a great story this is. Good, I see all the heads nodding here, and these are all young Canadians who are going to be inspired by the two of you. Let me just take a minute to say that, of course, Canada is a leader in the world in artificial intelligence, right? This university hired Jeffrey Hinton, who broke through, who did the breakthrough research on artificial intelligence. And he came to Canada because he wasn't happy in Britain, where they were not funding the work. He went to the United States, where there was always huge amounts of funding for research, but he didn't like the politics. And he came to Toronto because he didn't like the politics in the United States. And we were lucky enough to hire him, and he transformed the city of Toronto. He literally transformed the city single-handedly. So we have in Toronto, Google, Facebook, Autodesk. If you just go south of College all the way to the lake, those are all students of Jeffrey's, because people recognized Canada was a leader in talent, right? And then marry that now with what Tara just talked about. We have the technological expertise, but how do we leverage that in foreign policy? And how do we share that with other countries who face similar challenges, but don't have that expertise and aren't smart enough to have women like Tara who can see ahead? Because that's what leadership is about. It's about seeing ahead. So putting that task force together and thinking about the problems of the future, and leading on constructing the norms and the frameworks we're going to need as artificial intelligence is everywhere. Every one of you in this room has a phone. Every one of you is dependent on the most advanced semiconductors that are manufactured, by the way, at the very end stage in Taiwan, just to understand that connection between geopolitics. And every single one of you has an AI in your pocket. Who builds those, who codes them, who's responsible for them? How do we protect rights in an AI world? It should be inspirational to all of you that we have people who are leading that conversation. So I'm a very proud Canadian. I want to give, Marta, I want you to give Tara that certificate here, which is the David Peterson Young Leaders Award. I know the photographer wants a picture of the two of you.
Shall we go?
We're going to let him
we
do
go
that.
outside?
And then we will send it to you.
A picture with you, Janice?
Okay. There, no, I'll stand right on the side here. We'll put you in the back. Okay, very good. And I want you to join me all in thanking the students.